These birds were important. They were on the crest of the Storm Knights and was the overall sigil of the Storm King. Whether or not he was the Stormhawk King or whether the Stormhawk King was just his buddy, we don't really know, but that doesn't matter. We can tell by all the architecture in Stormville Castle and Castle Morn that these birds were the very pride of the Storm King and his knights, and to see them fall so far down and to be used as pawns and experimented on in the way they have been, all because they lost a war against the supposed good guys of the game. It's one of the great understated tragedies of the lore of this game. What happens to the soldiers of a conquered nation, since all they were guilty of was following the orders of their king? Welcome back to Honored Madman, and this one is for the birds. Not the
bird with teeth in this fashion?
That you may have seen me cover in previous videos. This one is about the birds with swords for feet and just how these Dr. Evil-esque creations came to be. The story all starts with the Stormhawks. These birds likely took this name from the legendary storm that once ravaged Stormville that was said to be their cradle. They served the Stormhawk King, a presumably large Stormhawk that may or may not have been the mysterious Storm King that we hear so much about. And if he wasn't the Storm King, then he most definitely served him given the relationship between the Storm Knights and the Stormhawks. Now this is all back before the age of the Erd Tree, so the Stormhawk King, the Stormcock if you will, likely swore allegiance to this era's version of an Elden Lord, the great dragon Placidusix, which is evidenced by the presence of the Banished Knights and Stormhawks in Farum Azula. These birds fought alongside the Banished Knights and exile soldiers, and were said to have sworn knightly vows to their Stormhawk King, which kind of implies that these birds are more sentient than they appear. Their presence on the battlefield was said to inspire their men to fight stronger and harder. And the birds themselves are formidable fighters in their own right, utilizing both their talons and beak in some of the more punishing combos of the game. So these birds lived in relative harmony alongside these banished knights and exile soldiers before they were banished and exiled. But everything changed when Godfrey came knocking. He would lay siege to the lands of Stormville and eventually crush the Stormhawk King and burn his remains into a pile of disobedient ash. The soldiers and knights were banished to penal colonies on the fringes of the lands between. It's also implied that Stormville Castle itself became a penal colony. Now the exact course of events that happened next is a bit speculative, but it appears at this point that the main force that the Stormhawks were a part of was then divided at some point. Some either found their way to Farum Azula or were there when Godfrey attacked, which would spare them from the same fate as their kinsmen. Although there is always the chance that they did flee there after the last loyalist of the Storm King fell, like the hero at Morn, who presumably was the last of the Stormhawk King's vassals to fall. Now at some point after Godfrey was banished from the lands between, the Night of Black Knives and the Shattering would both happen back to back, resulting in the deaths of several demigods. It was around this time that a famous demigod named General Radahn would attack Leyndell and be repelled by Morgott, aka the Veld Monarch, aka Margit the Fell Omen, a man of many names. But while this was happening, Godfrey's descendant Godric the Grafted would disguise himself as a woman to escape the capital unnoticed alongside all of his knights and loyalists. They would make their way to Stormville and claim ownership of it alongside the lands of Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula, the domain of the old Storm King, which technically belonged to the Golden Lineage by right of conquest, since Godfrey, conquered it. Which is seemingly backed up by the fact that we see Nefeli Lu, who is also a descendant of Godfrey, become the ruler of Limgrave and Stormville at the end of her questline, with the long dormant ashes of the Stormhawk King even possibly answering to her. But anyway, Godric would take Stormville and immediately start grafting. Maybe he was inspired by his ancestor, Godefroy, or Godefroy, or whatever the fuck his name is. You guys know, the Evergel boss. But Godric didn't just stop at experimenting on himself. No, he created grafted scions out of presumably his younger cousins, and turned the majestic Stormhawks that happened to be unfortunate enough to remain in Stormville into something that would give Dr. Evil a wet dream. He started with slicing off their talons and replacing them with single-bladed swords. But he did not stop there. Some were outfitted with this helmet that acted as like a flamethrower, and was also outfitted with a long spike to extend the reach of their pecking capabilities. They were also fitted with chains to keep them from escaping or flying too far from Stormville. It's unknown why the banished knights or exile soldiers did little or, if not anything, to save these birds from their unfortunate fates. It could be they were just too honor-bound by their loyalty to the heir of Godfrey, who had defeated their king so long ago, that it kept them from raising a sword against Godric to help their winged friends out. which is a theme often explored in George R.R. Martin's novels. But from what can be observed, the knights do have a deep relationship with these birds. We can even see one alongside another Stormhawk bird mourning a dead one in an out-of-the-way section of Stormville Castle. I guess that makes the fact that these banished knights and soldiers being forced to serve Godric even more tragic. Because as I said earlier, these birds and these knights fought right alongside each other. They likely viewed the birds as their equals but could do nothing to help them. The grafted ones also appear to have lost their innate connection with the storm, being unable to summon it in combat like the actual ungrafted Stormhawks, like Stormhawk Dean, who's technically undead, but still. Now before Godric could get to all of the birds in Stormville, he was paid a visit by the Severed Harpy who was on her southern march to Caelid. She crushed his forces and beat him within an inch of his life, but didn't kill him. Instead, she took the bulk of the storm forces, one legion led by Commander O'Neill and one led by General Niall. She would then presumably take O'Neill's legion alongside her Cleanrot Knights into Caelid to go fight Radahn, and well, we all know what happened next. It's unknown how many, or if any, of the birds accompanied her on this march. She left presumably a good amount of them at Stormville, alongside a handful of knights and a bunch of soldiers, which makes me think Godric was a bit of a captive lord, maybe a hostage of sorts. But at least by the events of the game, he seems to have regained control of the men. But honestly, who knows? I'm getting off topic. Melania would take the forces into Caelid, and they would be pretty much obliterated alongside most of her force. Although you can still find Commander O'Neill wandering through the Ionian swamp, presumably carrying Melania's broken needle. Or maybe it was a needle he was given by Mikola so it would help him resist the Scarlet Rot, since he was accompanying Melania on this long march. But it is safe to assume that any Stormhawks, or bladed Talon Eagles as they might now have been called if they were grafted, accompanied O'Neill into Caelid. They were likely killed by Melania's blast of Scarlet Rot. Now wait a second, wasn't this video supposed to be about the birds? I'm getting to it. But what of the other legion that these ginger twins had relieved Godric of? Well, Mikola took command of one of the remaining tattered legions of the Storm King, this one led by Punished Venom Niall, a man who looked very much like the human embodiment of the very battlefields you'd find him on. Mikola would take this legion up into the mountaintops of giants and station them at Castle Sol, where he began his work on the eclipse and trying to drain the sun of all its power in an effort to resurrect the dead demigods. And the Stormhawks that followed this legion out here eventually adapted white feathers and plumage that allowed them to better blend in with their new setting. In fact, a good amount of these birds don't even reside at Castle Sol. They seem to have just been freed in these mountains to make a new home for themselves. It's possible Niall did this to make up for all the years that the Banished Knights did nothing while the Stormhawks were brutally experimented on by a twisted lordling. Although Niall appears to have taken at least one of the grafted Stormhawks with him all the way to Castle Sol. Perhaps it's his personal one, but there is a grafted one with white plumage there, so that implies that he came all the way from Stormville after being grafted and settled with Niall's legion in Castle Sol, eventually developing the white plumage that the other ones have. There's actually two of the grafted white-plumed Stormhawks. I had totally forgotten about the other one. Now back to the Stormhawks that are still serving in Stormville. It's possible that the ones that did remain there aren't necessarily there to serve Godric or even Melania. Instead, I think it's possible that they stick around Stormville because it's their home. And even though they've been turned into messed up experiments, and their king has been slain, and the storm they were born in has all but vanished, they still have strong ties with this place that they were born, or what's left of it. And that these unfortunate birds stay here simply because they have nowhere else to go. Both of the storm generals are gone. As I said, their king is dead. All they have left is this castle, which unfortunately for them is inhabited by a backwoods yokel who just so happened to hit the lottery of being a descendant of a great warrior. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about these birds a little bit because yeah, I know a lot of people hate them because they're a relatively annoying enemy, especially the ones in Farum Azula. The description of that Warhawk ashes really made me want to make like a little video about them because they deserve it. They're really interesting enemies. And I found their story interesting because they really represent the aftermath of a war and what happens to the soldiers or troops that were loyal to the other side and, you know, what was done with them. I mean, the ones that stuck around in Stormville got the worst of it, while Melania presumably took some directly to their deaths by leading them into Caelid if she did in fact take some. The ones that made it to Castle Sol eventually found their freedom, and they appear to be doing okay as evidenced by their relatively high number in that well, overall awful place. So if they can thrive there, they can thrive anywhere. Overall, the luckiest ones, though, were the ones that managed to stay in Farum Azula or managed to flee to Farum Azula when Godfrey was killing everything. Since those ones seem to coexist peacefully amongst the dragons and even the beastmen in present-day Elden Ring, I say that some kind of agreement must have been arranged when it came to the remnants of the Stormhawks and the Golden Order's beastmen. But the fact is, most of these birds died really horrific deaths, being experimented on or just being used as cannon fodder by various demigods that didn't really respect them at all and just kind of used them as pawns. And if there's anybody we can blame directly, it would have to be Godfrey, but he was compelled to do this by Marika, so we can blame her more directly than him. Godfrey back then, if anything, was more of an instrument than an actual person. He was just a particularly sharp weapon used by Marika to carve out the lands between for herself and the Greater Will. Which is, I guess, the greatest irony of all, because Godfrey was being used as a pawn, these birds ended up being used as a pawn. Pretty much everybody ends up being a pawn at some point in the lands between when you're dealing with demigods and gods and spooky outer gods and whatnot. But that's all I really had to say on that subject. I hope you found it somewhat informative. Please let me know what you think in the comments. If you have any alternative theories to any of my takes involving the birds or Godric or the Storm King or any of that stuff, please share it in the comments. You guys know I love that. If you liked the video, please like it. If you disliked it, dislike it. And if you like hearing me rant about random video game stuff and the occasional movie or TV show, please consider subscribing. That really helps the channel out, especially now with YouTube being in the state of disarray that it's currently in. The long videos are also coming. I know you guys have been waiting for those for a long time, and well, I really do hate to keep you guys waiting, so they're going to come out really soon. The first one should be done in like a day or two, and I know I've said that before, but I mean it this time. But enough of me making excuses. Let's have our outro, and let's make it a good one. There will of course be more Hot D and Zelda videos, but I really want to finish up my string of almost done Elden Ring ones that I have on the docket. So those are first priority, but I might talk about Andor a bit. I know not many people have watched it, and I made a little video about it before it came out, where I was cautiously hopeful. And holy shit, honestly, I like this show just as much as I liked Hot D. I just got caught up on it, and I might make a couple videos about that, so we'll see how that goes. If any of you guys have seen the show, let me know what you think in the comments. I really like the Blade Runner feel it has. I don't know, something about it just makes it, the fact that it's not Star Wars-like makes it so appealing, I think. But I'll stop talking your guys' ears off, and I'll leave you guys with this. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time. Expect more videos. See ya.
Where you been, huh? Where you been?